Hello children, in today's video I am going to take the lesson breathing and exchange of gases, and we will first deal with the human respiratory system. We have learnt in 10th standard the human respiratory system comprises a pair of nostrils which is above the upper lip, and this pair of nostrils leads to the nasal chamber. See, a pair of nostrils leads to the nasal passage, and the nasal passage leads into the pharynx. We know pharynx is a common junction between the buccal cavity and the windpipe, and that part which is arising or leading to the windpipe is called the nasopharynx. The nasopharynx leads to the voice box or the larynx, which is in the throat region. It's a cartilaginous box which produces sound, and there is an opening called the glottis, and this chance of food when we swallow to get into the glottis. To prevent this, there is a cartilaginous flap of tissue called epiglottis that covers the glottis while swallowing, thereby preventing the food from entering into the glottis. So, glottis is an opening in the larynx, and larynx is part of the trachea. It opens into the tube called trachea. The trachea runs, it's a straight tube which runs down vertically till the mid of the thoracic cavity up till the fifth vertebra, where it divides into two branches, namely the right and left bronchi, and each bronchi enters the lungs. Once it enters the lungs, the bronchi divides and redivides into finer branches. The fine branches are primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, and the finer branch called the bronchioles. And these fine bronchioles opens into highly vascularized thin-walled air sacs called alveoli. So, once again we are having the respiratory system starts with a pair of nostrils which is above our upper lip. The nostrils leads into the nasal passage. Again there are two going up, then it becomes united and forms the nasopharynx. It's a common junction called the nasopharynx. Then the nasopharynx leads into the larynx, very important structure. Seeing in your throat, you can even sense it. Vibrations of the vocal cords results in the production of sound, and the larynx has an opening called the glottis. And this glottis, there's chance of the food when we swallow to get into the glottis. To prevent this is a cartilaginous flap. To prevent the food from entering, it covers this glottis. Then that cartilaginous flap is called epiglottis. Now the larynx leads into the trachea. The trachea is a straight vertical tube which runs down to the mid thoracic cavity, and somewhere around the fifth vertebra it divides into the right and left bronchi. Each bronchus enters the lungs, and within the lungs what happens? The bronchus divides and redivides, divides, redivides, and further divides, and the division goes like this way. First is the primary bronchi, then secondary bronchi, then finer branches called tertiary bronchi, and the most finest branch is the bronchioles, and these bronchioles ends up in air sacs. What are these air sacs? These air sacs are very fine, thin walled, irregular, highly vascularized air sacs and called alveoles. Now I told you about the lungs. The lungs are surrounded by two membranes, and these two membranes are called the pleural membrane, and between the two membranes there is a pleural fluid. It is very important to prevent friction, because always this movement of the lungs, so there is chance of wear and tear and friction. So there is this fluid between the two pleural membranes surrounding each lungs. Then there is another structure called the cartilaginous rings. It's not complete circular rings, it is C-shaped rings, cartilaginous rings. It is present right from the trachea till the finest branch called the bronchioles. It prevents the tube from collapsing. What happens if the tube collapses? We cannot breathe properly. So it is always the diameter is maintained wide because of these cartilaginous rings. The part from the nostrils, see, when I give it in the form of a flowchart, nostrils, it leads to the nasal passage. Nasal passage leads to the nasopharynx. Nasopharynx leads to the larynx. Larynx opens into the trachea. The trachea divides into the right and left bronchus, in plural, bronchi. So now it has entered the lungs, and within each lungs the bronchi divides into primary, secondary, tertiary, and the finest branch called the bronchioles. And finally you can see the bronchioles ends up in air sacs. Okay, highly vascularized air sacs. You open into the air sacs. Now you can see the part extending from your nostrils till the bronchioles. This entire part is called the conducting part. So conducting part starts from the nostrils all the way till the bronchioles. This is the conducting part, and the part that is only containing the alveolus is known as the exchange part. Now the role of the conducting part is to transport the gases, humidify the air, bring the temperature of the air to body temperature, and most important of all, it filters the air of foreign particles. So this is the function of the conducting part. So the conducting part starts right from your nostrils till the bronchioles, the entire tube system. It is involved in the transportation of air, both oxygen and carbon dioxide, humidifying the air. It should be humid. Then it brings down the temperature to the body temperature. If it's very cool air you are inhaling, it cannot be cool going down. It is brought to our body temperature 37 degrees, or if you are in the desert, you are inhaling very warm air, it cannot go like hot water going down into your windpipe, it cannot go hot. It should be brought down to the body temperature 37 degrees Celsius, and most important of all, defense. It filters the air of foreign substances. So these are the four functions of the conducting part. And the exchange part that involves only the alveolus. I told you the alveolus, the structure is they are thin walled and highly vascularized sacs, and the function is diffusion of gases. It helps in the diffusion of gases between the lungs and the atmospheric air. So this is all about the human respiratory system. So once again, the human respiratory system, it starts with the nostrils. So we have a pair of nostrils above the upper lip. It leads to the nasal passage. Nasal passage leads to the nasopharynx. Nasopharynx opens into the larynx, which is our voice box. And remember, in the voice box, there's an opening called the glottis. This glottis is not open always. There's a flap that covers it. This flap is known as the epiglottis. So when we swallow food, this epiglottis covers the glottis and prevents the food from entering into our voice box. That's why when we eat, our elders say don't talk, don't laugh while you eat. What happens is this glottis is open, and what happens, the food gets in and you get choked. So always while you eat, just concentrate only on eating. So when you swallow, the flap closes, but when you talk or when you sing, this glottis, the flap opens, and the chance of the food to get into your glottis, and this epiglottis is not doing its work of covering it. Then the larynx, as I told you, the cartilaginous voice box, then it leads to the trachea. It's a long tube, straight goes vertically down to the mid-thoracic cavity. Somewhere around the fifth vertebra, it divides into two, the right and left bronchus, which enters into each lungs. And within the lungs, this bronchus divides and redivides into finer branches. The branches are primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, and the finest branches, the bronchioles. And these bronchioles finally ends up into air sacs, and these air sacs are called the alveolus. Exchange of gases takes place at the air sacs. Now the function I told you from the nostrils to the bronchioles is called the conducting part, and the functions involved by the conducting part are transportation of the gases, humidifying the gases, then bringing the air to the body temperature, as well as filtering the air of foreign substances. And once again, alveolus is involved in the exchange of gases. Now we know where is our lungs located. It is located in the thoracic cavity, and remember that chamber is known as the thoracic chamber, and there's an anatomical setup which is very relevant for breathing. See, our lungs is inside this. Okay, inside this is our lungs. Okay, now this thoracic chamber. So this is the diagram of a thoracic chamber, a picture of a thoracic chamber. This thoracic chamber is formed of the breastbone or sternum. On the ventral side, in front on the ventral side there is a sternum. Immediately back, you know what is at the back? No, back is the vertebral column, and at the sides are the ribs. How many pairs of ribs we have? 12 pairs of ribs, of which only 10 reaches and forms a rib cage. 11 and 12 do not form the rib cage. So on the lateral sides are the ribs, and on the lower side is a dome shaped diaphragm. Muscular partition called the diaphragm. I am drawing the diaphragm. It's dome shaped diaphragm. So this is an airtight chamber, and this anatomical setup is very important for breathing. So once again, to describe the thoracic chamber, the lungs is located in the thoracic chamber, and this thoracic chamber is dorsally, on the dorsal side is the sternum, on the ventral side is the vertebral column, on the lateral sides are the ribs, and on the lower side is the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a muscular chamber or muscular partition which is dome shaped, separating the thoracic cavity from the abdomen. This anatomical setup is airtight, and the movement of air into our lungs and out of the lungs is caused due to the pressure gradient created, and this pressure gradient that is created due to the volume of the thoracic cavity. The volume of the thoracic cavity is not static, it changes, and when the volume of the thoracic cavity changes, what happens? The pressure also changes, and due to the changes in the pressure, the air gets in and exits. So now we are going to see the mechanism of breathing. We know two phases of breathing are inhalation and exhalation. What happens during inhalation? Air gets into our lungs through the conducting system, that is, which starts with your nostrils. And what happens during exhalation or expiration? Carbon dioxide rich air gets out. Okay, so we are going to see how this process of inhalation and exhalation occurs. It involves the movement of the diaphragm, it involves the movement of the ribs, and thereby it involves the volume of the thoracic cavity. And when the volume of the thoracic cavity is altered, what happens? The intrapulmonary pressure also alters, and this only enables pushing out of air or getting in of air. So let us see inspiration and expiration with the help of a video clipping, and so this will give you a visual impact. See the ribs, the diaphragm moves down and the ribs move forward, so the air enters because the volume has increased. Now we are going to learn about expiration or exhalation. What happens? The diaphragm returns to its original position, the ribs contract, the volume of the thoracic cavity decreases, and therefore the pulmonary pressure increases, pushing the air out of the system. So, the two phases of breathing are inspiration and expiration, or in other words you can say inhalation and exhalation. Now, let us see what happens with respect to the diaphragm, ribs, thoracic cavity, the volume of the thoracic cavity, the intrapulmonary volume and the movement of air. So, first analyze inspiration. During inspiration, the diaphragm contracts. The ribs move forward. As a result, what happens to the volume of the thoracic cavity? It increases. When the volume of the thoracic cavity increases, what happens to the pressure? It decreases. And therefore, air enters into the lungs. This movement of air into the lungs. On the other hand, during expiration, what happens is the diaphragm relaxes. It returns to its original position. The ribs also returns to its original position. As a result, what happens to the volume of the thoracic cavity? It reduces. Now, what happens to the intrapulmonary pressure? The pressure of the air increases, and therefore the air is pushed out. It exits out of the lungs. So, these are the two phases of breathing. With the help of the video I explained, and also with the help of the table, it will help you to understand the events occurring during inspiration and expiration. You must talk with respect to the diaphragm, the ribs, the volume of the thoracic cavity, the intrapulmonary volume and the movement of the air. So, once again, during inspiration you can practice, or you can do and understand the process. Inspiration, what happens when you inspire? Your diaphragm contracts. When your diaphragm contracts, what immediately happens? You can see your ribs moving forward or upward. So, as a result, when your diaphragm contracts and your ribs move forward, what do you understand? The thoracic cavity, the volume has increased. Then what happens? The intrapulmonary volume decreases. The pressure of the air then decreases. Therefore, there is chance of the air from outside to get inside. So, this is the events occurring during inspiration. On the other hand, during expiration, what happens? Your diaphragm returns to its original location. And what happens to your ribs? Ribs also returns or relaxes. As a result, what happens to the chest cavity or the thoracic cavity? It reduces. Then what happens to the pressure of the air there? It increases, and therefore the air is pushed out of the lungs. So, very, very important, the movement of the air into and out of the lungs is caused due to the pressure gradient, and this pressure gradient is due to the movements of the diaphragm and the ribs. That is why our diaphragm and the ribs are in motion, and we have this thoracic chamber which enables this movement of the diaphragm. See, the diaphragm is muscular dome shaped partition which can move, it is movable, and also ribs, though it is bony, it is not static. There are the muscles called the intercostal and the internal intercostal muscles and the external intercostal muscles. See, you can see what is in red, these are the intercostal muscles. Because of the muscles, the ribs move in and out. Okay. So, this is very, very important for the process of breathing. In the next video, we will be dealing with the different steps involved in respiration. Now, what I dealt is with breathing, which is a physical mechanism involving the two phases, inhalation and exhalation. Thank you.